Is Mali back to the brink? Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to the France 24 debate. The central authority in Bamako, arguably weaker than at any point since 2013, when French intervention stopped radical insurgents trying to swoop down from the north. We'll ask about recent legislative elections marred by irregularities, an opposition leader kidnapped and missing since March, deadly protests in the capital, and an influential imam who this time has sided against President Ibrahim Boubacar Keita. Elected in 2013, after first France, then African Union forces arrived to thwart that advance of the alliance of jihadists and Tuareg separatists, Mali's president has struggled since to show progress in a landlocked West African nation that stretches from the Sahara to neighboring states more and more beset as well by massacres targeting both the military and civilians, a mix of radical Islam and land disputes coming to a head. Does France, as the former colonial power, own that instability that we're witnessing again and again these days in the Sahel? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the pressure on Mali's president, and with us to talk about it, she's in Marrakesh. Halimatou Souko, human rights activist, president of Feminists Without Borders. Is that how you translate it?
Yes, exactly. Feminists Sans Frontières, Feminists Without Borders. Thank you for inviting me.
We want to welcome from Paris, Dugukolo Bakonare, teacher of Fulani Society at INALCO. That's the Language Institute here in Paris, and also a columnist on international affairs. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Also in the French capital, Emmanuel Dupuy, president of the Institute for Perspective and Security in Europe think tank. Welcome back to the show.
Always a pleasure to be here.
And from New York City, Andrew Leibovich, he's a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter. The hashtag is F24debate. That pressure on a Malian president known as Ibeka had been building. Then last week, the protests turning violent, 11 killed. An anti-terror unit has since been accused of using live ammunition. Mario Sofos has more.
Ça, c'est les balles. Ça, c'est les balles. Tu ne peux pas écouter le bruit des balles, mais si tu vois les trucs, tu sais que c'est balle qui est rentrée là. Donc, qu'est-ce qu'on va le dire? Nous tous, on est là. On est prêts à mourir.
These funerals are an opportunity for Imam Mahmoud Dicko, a central figure in the opposition movement, to launch an appeal for calm.
Je partage entièrement le combat et la préoccupation de M5, mais pas dans la violence. Je ne suis pas dans la violence. Et je pense réellement que nous pouvons être forts, aller imposer notre point de vue sur le faux même dans le cadre de droit, sans rentrer dans vraiment sans qu'on nous pousse à aller vers la faute.
As for the Malian president, on Sunday he announced a first concession.
J'ai donc décidé d'abroger les décrets de nomination des membres restants de la Cour constitutionnelle.
The opposition have been demanding the dissolution of Mali's constitutional court for months. It accuses the court of having unjustly invalidated the victories of certain candidates during last spring's parliamentary elections. Yet the candidates are expecting far more than just the dismissal of constitutional judges, and the opposition are calling for protests to continue until the president resigns. Demonstrators are denouncing the state's corruption and its failures. All of this while the threat of violence linked to jihadist groups remains in Mali.
Halimatou Souko, how do you explain what's going on right now in Mali?
The situation right now in Mali is very worrying. And we can say that it's a long series of frustration by the Malian people. They denounce today the powerlessness of the state power, the systemic corruption, and also very discrimination, violence, and So that's very how can I say that? There is a fed up. There is a fed up from the Malian people, according to the powerlessness of the state power, and that's it.
And so should President Ibrahim Boubacar Keita step down like those demonstrators are asking?
Yes, they're asking for him to resign, and that's very that's very good. But for Ibrahim Boubacar Keita, in his recent speeches, he make it quite clear that he's not going to resign, and that he is open for dialogue, for a dialogue, a solution in the dialogue, but not in the resignation.
Dico Bakonare, why now? Why is this coming to a head right now?
After the National Assembly was set up after the elections, there have been several accusations of wrongdoings, of cheating during the election and the electoral process in general. And afterward, when the president of the National Assembly was elected by his peers, there was this sentiment that this is the summit. This is really the peak of whatever is wrong with the regime, because he himself is a very controversial figure. He's someone who was in student associations that are known for violence. And so in seeing this, it was like a promotion from being a bully to a political tool that will only further the political class, the government's ideals. So the National Assembly wasn't really representing the people in their frustration. So I think all this came together right now, and this is why it's sort of imploding.
Dugu, just before the French had to intervene in 2013, there had been a coup in Mali. The central authority had been so weak, and people had then too been fed up that it seems as though insurgent groups took advantage of that weakness and seized towns in the north. Your thoughts on why it is that it seems like we're back to square one?
Well, everything is different now. You have the UN force, the MINUSMA. You also have the French forces, Barkhane, even though they're not based in Bamako. And then you have all this general feeling that we're not going to let the regime down. It's not like 8 years ago. 8 years ago, the government opened up discussion. Then, they let the military have a lot of leeway. They welcome wives of soldiers up in the north. And so I think it was sort of an accidental coup. It's nothing like today where the regime has a hold on the army, and they actually have subtle ways of ensuring that there's virtually never going to be a coup. And I think that's part of the reason why everyone is in the streets right now. They know that the soldiers aren't going to step up. So they're trying to find their own ways, which may be to condemn or not.
Andrew Leibovich, you agree 2020 is not 2013?
Yeah, I think it's a very different situation for a number of reasons. As Dico said, the position of Ibeka with the military and in power is very different from his predecessor. But at the same time, this is a very severe political crisis with the backdrop of security tensions, ongoing massacres of civilians. So it's created a different kind of tension. But what we're seeing now, I think, is just this boiling over of frustration with the lack of progress, not only on security issues, on political issues, but also economic issues. And so there's an enormous amount of frustration, I think, in Malian society, and we're seeing that really come to a head now.
It seems to be a chronic problem, Emmanuel Dupuy, in Mali. After the last crisis, they promised there'd be some great reforms, that there'd be a more inclusive way of governing. And yet we're back to this crisis situation with a central power that doesn't have very much authority.
Absolutely. And when President Ibrahim was reelected in August 2018, he said he would deliver, which he hadn't delivered during his first mandate. And I think precisely this is why we are in a crisis. a lot of what President Boubacar was elected for, the implementation of the Algiers Accord, for example, has not been implemented. Only not more than 27% of this accord has been put in issue. President Boubacar promised to do the legislative elections. They just happened a few weeks ago when they were due to happen already in 2015. So I think there's a sort of a wide setup of reasons why the insurgency is going on the streets. Impunity, that has been mentioned, corruption, that has been mentioned as well. Of course, there is the new perspective of having a certain number of issues inside the Malian military, the reformed Malian military. United Nations and Human Rights Watch have been delivering quite a few perspectives on a certain number of claims, of exactions committed by the Malian authorities, the Malian forces, as well as the Nigerian and Burkina Faso forces, which brings this idea that there is impunity when it comes to fighting against terrorist groups. And of course, we do have in mind that the outspread, which is going down on the streets, is very interesting because it is under the authority of one of the first political and social and cultural leaders of the country, which was a colleague and ally of the President Boubacar in 2012. So everyone is turning back on the president. This is
you're talking
true.
there about Imam Dicko.
Yes,
I want to
Mahmoud
get back
Dicko.
to him in a moment, but just to remind our viewers right now that even though 2020 is not 2013, the domestic situation in Mali has got neighbors worried enough that the regional body, the ECOWAS, sent a special envoy who arrived in the Malian capital on Wednesday, Nigeria's former president, Goodluck Jonathan.
With your cooperation and the good people of Mali who will want to solve the problems, not about individuals, but about the collective interests of the country, I think we'll have a way of resolving the issues. This must be man-made issues, not earthquakes that we have no control. So I believe we'll be able to get something done. You will work with us and we'll succeed.
What does that tell you, Emmanuel Dupuy, the fact that ECOWAS is in town?
ECOWAS is in town for the second time. There was a previous mission which failed. This previous mission was under the authority of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Burkina Faso the first time, a few days ago, before the riot of the 10th of July, which of course produced, unfortunately, the killing of 8 of Malian people. So what it tells me is that ECOWAS is waking up a bit slowly. ECOWAS was not implicated in the fight against terrorist organization, as we have had the obligation of creating an hybrid formula, which is the G5 Sahel. The last time ECOWAS spoke about the importance of spreading to all of the West African region, because the terrorist organizations are spreading, not only in Sahel, but now they are targeting Ivory Coast, where 13 of the military have been killed 2 weeks ago. And we have proofs and elements showing that they are now targeting Gulf of Guinea countries such as Togo, wanting to strike such as Togo, Benin, and Ghana. And ECOWAS is waking up, so it's important that it does that. It's important that President Goodluck Jonathan has the right authority, of course, to put pressure on President Boubacar, because I think this is what it is all about, just to put the dot or put the finger where it should be. And I think when Mahmoud Dicko points out the fact that he is not totally in accordance with some of the grievances of the population who wants just to throw out Boubacar, he is calling for more integration or more, let's say, inclusiveness inside the government, which again was something that President Boubacar promised already a few months ago.
Yeah, you mentioned him there, Imam Dicko, who was a one-time supporter of Boubacar. Today, he seems to be the kingmaker for the opposition. Laurent Berstecker has more.
The central figure of Mali's protest movement, Mahmoud Dicko has over the past decade imposed himself as a major player in Malian politics. After completing his studies in Saudi Arabia, Dicko returned to Mali in the early 80s. An advocate of traditionalist West African Islam rather than Saudi Wahhabism, he was named head of Mali's influent High Islamic Council in 2009. There, he campaigned against a reform of family law, eventually forcing the government to water down a text bolstering women's rights. Building on his reputation as a religious conservative, Dicko repeatedly tried to negotiate with Islamist militant groups after they overtook northern Mali in 2012. In 2013, he endorsed Ibrahim Boubacar Keita for his first presidential campaign, but he abandoned the president 4 years later and stepped down from the Islamic Council to create his own political party. A vocal critic of the government's inability to tackle the country's jihadist insurgency, endemic corruption, and spiraling economy, Dicko was one of the main organizers of the June 2020 protests.
Aujourd'hui, c'est la nation malienne qui est en train de s'effriter. Ça commande que tous les enfants de ce pays-là se mettent ensemble aujourd'hui pour faire un sursaut national, aller vers une refondation vraiment de notre pays.
It wasn't the first time Mahmoud Dicko made a political U-turn. After initially welcoming France's military intervention in northern Mali in 2013, he's since accused Paris of harboring neo-colonial ambitions and has repeatedly called for the departure of French troops.
Let me ask you, Alimata Souko, you saw in that report, he's no newcomer to Malian politics. What do you make of Imam Dicko?
Imam Dicko is an influential religious leader in Mali, and he is known for his conservative views on women's rights. For instance, in 2012, there was a project in order to give more rights in women for women with the code. The Malian Code of Family, and he was between the figures that said that this project can be passed, because in the project there was the statement of gender equality, gender opportunities, equal opportunities, and equal rights between men and women, and
he won effectively. That part was scrapped.
What?
And he won. There was no mention in the end.
Yes. Unfortunately, this project was very interesting in terms of gender equality, but with the influence of religious group, unfortunately, the project hasn't been passed. And today in Mali, we have a highest rate of domestic violence, of female genital mutilation, and there is no law actually in Mali that prohibits female genital mutilation, and that's very disturbing and very serious, because it's a crime, it's a violence on women's bodies. But today there is no law on that to prohibit that, and because of the influential the influence of religious groups on politics, and so that's very disturbing and very difficult.
Is Imam Dicko's central position good or bad for Mali's democracy?
I think we can say that it's bad. We can say that it's bad because he has very conservative views. But we have also we can say that we are in a conservative country. We are in a very conservative country. This is the reason why he is loved by many people in Mali, and so we can say that he has views that are very problematic, specifically on women's rights. But today he he is someone who has influence. So that's very complicated.
Very complicated. Andrew Leibovich, is Imam Dicko his own man? Is he somebody the West should worry about?
What?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily fair to frame this in terms of should the West be worried about him. The question is really, what do Malian citizens want? And his positions, his calls for political reform, and his criticism, particularly of corruption, have obviously have hit home for many people. There are questions, I think, particularly in Europe and the U.S. And in the region, about what is his political project really, and that's very hard to say. I think certainly he is his own man. He's someone who's a very astute observer of Malian politics. He's obviously been very implicated in a number of political, social, and obviously religious events over the last several decades in Mali. So he's very implicated in some of the main debates in Malian society today. But he's also he's aware of his own position. He's also, of course, he has allies and he has friends, and he has even people that he listens to, and people that he publicly defers to, like another religious leader, Mohammed Sheikh Nahamala, or known as the Sheriff of Nioro. So he's a part of these systems and groupings of people as well. So he's not just a lone actor, let's say.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, because it's almost become an afterthought. We don't even mention it much anymore. But the leader of Mali's opposition has been kidnapped for 3 months now. Soumaila Cissé, who was campaigning for those legislative elections when he was abducted near his home constituency. Two-time presidential runner-up in 2013 and 2018. And Imam Dicko, Andrew Leibovich, had tried a mediation with Islamist insurgents. What does that tell you about the current state of Mali?
Well, it's quite striking, first of all, that Soumaila Cissé could be kidnapped in the first place. It demonstrates this patchwork of security arrangements that exists in northern Mali and in central Mali, and the fact that even for people with local connections, even for people with prominent ties, and who someone like Cissé, who not only is very well known, but who had, according to reports, negotiated arrangements with different armed groups, potentially even with jihadist groups, to be able to travel through the area and to be able to campaign in the area. And the fact that he was kidnapped anyway shows how fragile these arrangements are, and the fact that even someone like Soumaila Cissé could not obtain effective guarantees for his own safety. So it speaks to a kind of general fragmentation and breakdown that is ongoing.
Duguloko Bakonare, you agree?
You know, there's one thing that I've spoken with Andrew about a while before. It's this kind of role, this narrative about the Imam Dicko that, you know, all of us are sort of fueling, that, you know, he's sort of like the hippopotamus that you're, you know, making into a crocodile. He's someone really major. He's important, and we all agree on that. He's decided to take on a role with the mediation. But I also think that he's someone who's not impacted that much what's happening. If the people weren't backing him up, I mean, if the people didn't have their own agendas, there will be no Mahmoud Dicko. The people are here, and everyone is coming with their own aspirations and their own wishes. And because Dicko is here, you know, with some money, and Dicko is the one person that's actually seen as a threat by both the international community and Mali, the government of Mali. This is the reason why he's being put at the forefront of everything. And one thing that we shouldn't forget is that Dicko actually has been having a sort of ambiguous relationship with Malian governments. In 2017, he seemed to be opposed to the government. And then 1 year later, he was back, and then he was supporting the regime. And then now sort of changed. And then he reverted back to this position of saying, well, I don't really want the regime to fall. I want to have a mediation, etc., etc. And that's sort of making him into a figure that people will think they cannot trust. You know, he's also one of the people sustaining the regime with maybe, you know, getting some sort of resources from him. And also, you know, I'd like to get back to something that I've discussed with Alimatu as well. we're talking about things happening right now. All these things we agree on, we've talked about them before. And I think, we can pretty much find out about them in the news in general. But there's one thing that's really important. When the protests happened in 2012, the women actually weakened the regime. At least they're the ones who made the regime seen as something problematic. And the other day, I was reading a report from the field saying that people were mentioning that it's the moms, the aunties that are bringing food to protesters. And every single one of these protesters and jihadists in the field, etc., they have a mother behind them. They have these people, who can intervene in appointing them in the way that they want to go into groups, whether religious groups or armed groups or social movements, etc. So I think that there is a couple of social unease and social hardship that we have to try to solve. I'm not saying that all women in Mali are progressive, they're not conservative, etc., etc. But I do believe that they want their voices to be heard. And I think that there may be some big surprise if things keep going the way that they are, and the government is unveiled for what it is, and Dico is also unveiled as what it is, and that will put at the forefront protesters and anyone supporting them, including.
All right, let me put that to Halimatu Suko, because in 1992, when multi-party democracy came to Mali, it was a demonstration by women that took down the longtime dictator Moussa Traoré. In the images we saw at the beginning of the show, we didn't see many women in the crowd, did we? So I'm wondering, you heard there Dugukolo saying how women are not one monolithic block in Mali, but could they ultimately decide which way this goes?
Yes, it's true that all women are not feminist. All women are not feminist. That's something clear. But in Mali, for decades, there are many feminist organizations that do a lot of work in order to promote gender equality, in order to make something like to demand gender equality laws, because today in our laws there are many problematic things. For instance, in the code of La Famille, the code of family in Mali, it is said that women have to obey their husband, and so we can say also that a 15 years old girl can be married with the consent of her parents. So there are many problems in the laws and that are discriminating women. And for the decade, there are many mobilization from Malian women in order to demand gender equality. But it is true that there are not all women in this fight. That is something true.
All right,
and it's not specific to Mali. It's also in other countries.
For sure. When we look at the broader region now and the crisis taking place in Mali, Emmanuel Dupuy, what does France do? France, which has some 5,000 troops right now with Operation Barkhane, chasing jihadist insurgents in the north of the country.
Well, France is preoccupied as well as the regional countries. This was one of the assets which was mentioned during the last G5 summit in Nouakchott. We're worried and preoccupied, again, without doing any ingerence in the political landscape of Mali, because there are a certain number of elections coming, very important elections coming. And I think what is happening in Bamako can fuel a certain number of grievances in a broader region. There will be elections by the end of the year in two neighboring countries, Ivory Coast and in Burkina Faso. And this is one of the preoccupations that France has, as we're seeing activists in Ouagadougou saying, well, we have the same grievances against President Kabore because he has not delivered, and people are still dying in the region. There are now more than 800,000 Burkinabe people who have been obliged to flee their house in behalf of the fact that almost 25% of the territory is no longer under the authority of the government. So there's, I think, an utmost importance of seeing what's happening in Bamako. I would again argue the fact that Mahmoud Dicko, Imam Mahmoud Dicko, is not as radical as some has pointed out. First of all, there's been a bit of, in the recent days, not to say the recent hours, a sort of hiatus amongst the followers of Imam Dicko, whether or not there should be a manifestation today, tomorrow, Friday, on behalf of the fact that there is an inquiry on how the anti-terrorist force, Forsat, again, as your reportage mentioned it, used illegally or maybe abusively the use of power. Mahmoud Dicko is, I think, less radical than some of the people who are in the coordination, which was created under his name, coordination for the sustainers of Mahmoud Dicko. And of course, his son-in-law, I have in mind his son-in-law, Issa Kawe Jim, and the former minister of Ibeka, because again, this has to be argued. Most of the people who are fueling the manifestation in the streets were sustainers of President Ibeka, whether in 2013, in 2018, or just a few months ago.
And again, it brings us back to the question of what France does, because
I did respond. I'm sorry, I said this one.
We saw there was at the beginning of the year a G5 Sahel summit. The countries that are involved in these security operations in the region that took place in southwestern France, where there were some sharp words between the French president and the Malian president, basically Emmanuel Macron dressed him down, saying, you can't criticize us on the one hand, and on the other hand, ask us to send troops.
Again, I do apologize, I didn't respond to your question. Well, France, again, is asking for the Malian authorities to promise what they to deliver and to put concretely what they promised. Boots on the ground, and having the reformed military of Mali not doing exactions or not having actions against civil society, but helping to fight against the insurgency. That's the first thing. Second of all, France has asked for the liberation of Soumaila Cissé, which has been now under hostages for 90 days, which is, of course, absolutely awkward, as he was the frontrunner, as you mentioned.
Who's holding him?
Sorry?
Who's holding him? Who's holding him?
Well, President Ibrahim was a bit unprecise about that. He mentioned in his last speech that he has proofs of lives. He didn't prove them, of course. Some argue that the insurgency, that the terrorist armed groups which took him may not be terrorist groups but criminal groups, and this is why maybe there is this financial question. And of course, when and where he was taking in hostages, may tend to believe that he was in an area where Iyad Al-Ghali, the Tuareg leader of the Groupe de Soutien à l'Islam et aux Musulmans, was having operations. But again, if that was the case, then why all of the people who are in liaison with him, Mahmoud Dicko tried to do this in 2012. The terrorist groups did not follow up on that. Why don't we have more than a proof of life only mentioned by the president? This is why a certain number of the political leaders and the Mouvement du 5 Juin and Rassemblement des Forces Patriotiques have put in one of their documents of the memorandum of 14 June that they want concrete proof of life of the former of the leader of the Union Républicaine Démocratique.
Andrew Leibovich, again, I'll ask to you the same question I asked Emmanuel Dupuy. Does France own this?
I wouldn't quite use that language to describe it, but certainly France has a responsibility. France has this very significant military presence under Operation Barkhane. What happens politically in Mali is not the fault of France per se, but France is implicated, and France does, I think, have a responsibility and has tried to play, at least in some cases, a responsible role in resolving these issues. But at least when talking about political conflict and disagreement over the future of Mali, that's something for Mali's people to decide, not for France.
And how much, when you look at the at the balance sheet over the last months, you have on the one hand the killing by the French forces of some high-profile jihadists, some military victories. You've also had casualties. You've had a lot of casualties, both among Malian military and civilians. The same can be said for neighboring Burkina Faso, and even, as Emmanuel Dupri mentioned, inside of Ivory Coast. So where does it stand right now, Andrew Leibovich, on the military front, if you will?
Well, it does seem that there have been some improvements in some areas, particularly on the sort of tri-border area in the Tako Gourma between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. But as you highlighted, the ongoing killings of civilians, pressure against civilians from military groups, but particularly from militias and from regional armed forces, are of enormous concern and remain an issue of enormous concern for everyone. And so I think even French officials acknowledge that the security situation remains very tenuous, and that the gains that they have claimed could be reversed. So I think this remains a very fragile security situation, even with, as you mentioned, the killing of the leader of Al-Qaeda in the South Maghreb, Keita, as well as the removal of other militant leaders. This remains very concerning.
Dugukolo Bakonare, at this point in time, when we hear reports regularly of dozens killed here, soldiers ambushed there, is it about an Islamist insurgency the way it was in 2013, or is it about other things, most notably that bitter rivalry between herders and farmers in both Mali and Burkina Faso?
So I'd like to say that the terrorists aren't who we're saying are. Lots of people have been killed by ethnic militias, by bandits. Other people were killed by government agents like soldiers. And this is very different from what's happening in Bamako. In rural areas, it's not about Islamism. I mean, Islamists are there and they're doing a lot of things. There's no doubt about that. But insecurity and the absence of the government are fueling defiance, and that is going to factor in whatever is going to happen in the background and whatever is going to make the regime even more fragile. And you also have diasporas from rural areas in Bamako. I mean, no one is from Bamako. We're all from somewhere. So everybody knows what's happening to their family members. I remember hearing some chatter in Fulani groups saying that people were going to go out, they were going to protest the government because they know that their relatives were killed. And so they think it's the government's fault. I remember very precisely during a protest here in Paris, people were saying, yeah, Ibeka, genocidaire, Ibeka, you're a criminal, etc., etc. And I was telling some of them, no, this is something you can say. I mean, you can say that some people in the military are to blame, whatever, etc. But this is not Ibeka being genocidal. But if this is what the people think at large, the regime's going to fall. I have no doubt about that, because the situation is going to be so messy and so toxic, there will be no way that it's going to be sustainable.
And how do you explain the fact that this is coming to a head, not just in Mali, but in Burkina Faso and as far away as Nigeria even?
There's a narrative about Islamist groups coming in. There's a narrative about herders, farmer conflict, which, any meeting that I've been to, I've heard the same things. And in my opinion, it comes down to a major lack of integration between these countries, within the ECOWAS, between the African Union. They've given so much leeway to criminal organizations and to foreign governments as well. And they haven't been consolidating whatever they've been trying to do since the independence. So there is no surprise that criminals, terrorists, militias are going to occupy these zones, and the transborder zones, this is why they're so fragile. This triangular area between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso is one of the most tense, and there's some reason for that.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. So much more to talk about as this story continues to unfold. I want to thank you, Dugukolo Bakonare. I want to thank as well Alimatu Suko for being with us today from Marrakesh, Emmanuel Dupuis in Paris, Andrew Leibovich in New York. Much more on Mali and the broader region on our website, france24.com, as well as Facebook. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Bye for now.
Join us for a special edition of Talking Europe on France 24 from Luxembourg. Now, this is the EU's wealthiest member state, but one which found itself in a literal bind when the coronavirus pandemic swept across the continent as borders started closing. For a tiny landlocked country which imports almost all of its fruit and vegetables, that was a major concern. In our programme, we'll be finding out what lessons can be learned on that issue of food supplies, not just for Luxembourg, but for the rest of the EU as well. Join us for Talking Europe on France 24.
Talking Europe, presented by Catherine Nicholson on France 24 and France24.com.